What would you think if a woman stripped of her name, sold as number 17 on a frozen Wyoming auction block, was bought by a silent rancher who cut her bonds and gave her warmth? Was he a savior, a captor, or the beginning of a love story, hidden in the snow? The cold was the first thing I truly felt in years. Not the chill of a damp cell or the indifferent draft of a barn, but a deep biting cold that seemed to want to find my bones and stay there. It was a living thing, this cold, carried on a wind that scoured the hard-packed snow in the town square, whipping it into stinging clouds. They lined us up on the raw timber of the auction block, our bare feet turning blue against the wood. We were numbers, not names. A line of shivering, exhausted women, our thin cotton shifts offering no defense against the Wyoming winter. My name was gone. I had packed it away in a small, dark corner of my mind, a place I rarely visited anymore. To remember it was to remember the girl who owned it, and that girl was a ghost. All that was left was number 17. I kept my eyes fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the mountains. They were sharp and unforgiving, but they were honest. They didn't leer or whisper. They didn't smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. The crowd below was a restless sea of dark wool coats and fur hats, their breath pluming in the frigid air. I learned long ago to stop hearing the words, the crude jokes and assessments. I listened only to the tone, a current of ugly hunger that flowed beneath the noise. When the auctioneer, a fleshy man with a face reddened by the cold and the bottle, began his patter, his voice cracked like ice on a frozen puddle. One by one, the women beside me were sold. A rancher with hands like shovels bought a girl for his kitchens. A saloon owner with a wet, crooked smile bought two. Each transaction was a hammer blow, and I braced myself for my own. And now number 17. The auctioneer bellowed, his voice echoing slightly in the frozen air. A bit weathered, but there's work in her yet. Who'll start the bidding for 17? A wave of murmurs, a few dismissive chuckles. I was too thin, my eyes too empty. I offered no promise of a soft spirit or an easy smile. I was a tool, and a worn one at that. $20 a man near the front grunted, not even bothering to look at me, his eyes on the bottom of his flask. The auctioneer tried to work his magic, but the crowd was cold and impatient. Then from the very back, a different sound. Not a word, just a slight movement. A man who had been standing perfectly still, a pillar of silence against the swirling snow, lifted a gloved hand, 2 fingers raised. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, even under a heavy sheepskin-lined coat that had seen better decades. A wide-brimmed hat, stained and weathered, was pulled low, shadowing his face. He stood apart from the others, his posture radiating a stillness that was more intimidating than any swagger. "I have 30, the auctioneer crowed, his eyes lighting up. The man with the flask snorted. 30 for that bag of bones, he can have her. But another man, a trapper with a greasy beard, laughed. "I'll go 35. Might be good for mending traps." The quiet man at the back didn't hesitate. He raised his fingers again. 40, the trapper scowled. The bidding stalled. The crowd grew restless, their boots stamping on the frozen ground. No one wanted a bidding war over damaged goods, especially not with a stranger who looked like he was carved from the same granite as the mountains at his back. He had an aura of finality about him. "Sold for $40 to the silent gentleman in the back." The sound of the gavel was like a crack of doom. My stomach clenched. I had a new master. I didn't watch him approach, keeping my gaze locked on the mountains. I heard the crunch of his worn leather boots on the snow, a slow, deliberate sound. He didn't stop in front of me to inspect his purchase. He walked directly to the auctioneer, pulling a small, worn leather pouch from his coat. I heard the clink of coins counted out without a word. Then those boots were in front of me. I braced myself, expecting a rough hand on my arm, a shove in the direction he wanted me to go. Instead, he knelt. The motion was so unexpected it made me flinch. From his belt, he drew a small, sharp knife. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he meant to use it on me, but he reached for the coarse rope binding my wrists. With one clean upward slice, the fibers parted. The sudden freedom was a shock. My hands, numb and useless, fell to my sides. He rose to his full height, and for the first time I saw his face in the sliver of shadow beneath his hat brim. It was a hard face, etched with lines the sun and wind had carved. His eyes were a pale, clear gray like a winter sky, and they held no heat, no triumph, nothing I knew how to read. He looked at me, truly looked, for a single long moment. Then he turned, untied a heavy wool blanket from his saddle, and held it out. It wasn't a gesture of kindness, not in the way soft people are kind. It was practical. A simple statement of fact: you are cold, this is warm. I hesitated, my muscles locked in suspicion. He simply stood there holding the blanket, his patience as vast and silent as the snow-covered plains around us. Finally, my shivering hands reached out and took it. The wool was coarse and smelled of horse and wood smoke, but the warmth that began to seep into my skin was the most profound comfort I had known in an age. He turned and walked toward his horse, a big, sturdy roan that stood patiently, its breath misting in the air. He swung himself into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion. He had another horse, a smaller mare, tethered behind. He didn't look back, didn't issue a command. He just sat there waiting. He was giving me a choice. Run, and you'll freeze to death before you clear the town limits. Stay, and what I didn't know. But the memory of that knife, not used as a threat but as a tool of release, made the decision for me. I wrapped the heavy blanket around my shoulders, the rough wool scratching my chin, and walked toward the second horse. My feet were blocks of ice, but I barely felt them. With clumsy, numb fingers, I grabbed the saddle horn and pulled myself up, and that's how I followed him out of that town, a ghost trailing a silent man into a world of white. We rode for hours. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled plodding of the horse's hooves in the deep snow and the mournful sigh of the wind through skeletal aspen groves. He never looked back, but he set a slow, steady pace, one the tired mare could easily keep. The sun was a pale, useless wafer in a sky the color of dishwater. The cold deepened, settling into my marrow. I watched his back, the straight, unyielding line of his spine. He was a mystery, and in my world mysteries were always dangerous. But he hadn't hurt me. He hadn't spoken a single word to me. He had simply cut my bonds and given me a blanket. It was so little, and yet it was everything. Just as the weak afternoon light began to fail, turning the snow from white to a bruised purple, he led us off the main track and into a thick stand of pines. Nestled in a hollow, almost invisible until you were upon it, was a small cabin. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress against the cold. Built of thick, dark logs with a low-pitched roof heavy with snow, it had one door and a single small window dark as a blind eye. A plume of old smoke long since dissipated had stained the stone chimney black. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He didn't look at me or offer a hand. He walked to the door, lifted a heavy wooden bar and pushed it open. Then he stepped aside, leaving the way clear. Another choice. I could stay out here and freeze, or I could enter his space. I slid stiffly from the mare's back, my legs nearly buckling. I stood there for a long moment, the wind tearing at my blanket. Then I took a breath and stepped over the threshold. The inside was one small room, and it smelled of old smoke, pine, and dust. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. There was a simple plank table and two chairs, a narrow bed built into the far wall, and a second cot folded and leaning against the wall. It was the sparest room I had ever seen, yet it was not unkind. It was a place of purpose, and that purpose was survival. He came in behind me, bringing a gust of frigid air, and closed the door, dropping the heavy bar back into place. The sound echoed in the small space, a note of finality. He moved with quiet efficiency, lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing a room that was clean but not lived in. It was a place a man used, not a home he loved. Without a word, he walked over to the folded cot, opened it with a single sharp snap of his wrists, and placed it on the opposite side of the room from his own bed. He unrolled a second wool blanket, clean but worn thin, and laid it on top. Then he went to the hearth, knelt, and began to build a fire, his back to me the entire time. I stood by the door, a statue wrapped in wool, watching him. He had given me my own space, a clear and defined territory within his own. He was telling me without words that I was not to be his bedmate. I was not a guest, but I was not chattel either. I was something else. Something I didn't have a name for. The fire caught, and a welcome wave of warmth began to spread through the room. He hung a blackened pot over the flames, filled it with snow from a bucket by the door, and added chunks of dried meat and vegetables from a sack. The smell that soon filled the cabin was rich and savory, and it made my empty stomach ache with a fierce, painful cramp. He ladled the stew into 2 tin bowls, placed them on the table, and then sat down in one of the chairs. He looked at me, his gray eyes unreadable in the flickering lamplight, and gave a slight nod toward the empty chair. I moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. I sat on the very edge of the chair, my back straight, the bowl of hot stew before me. I waited. I didn't know the rules here. Was I to wait for him to eat first? He seemed to understand. He picked up his spoon, dipped it into his bowl, and began to eat. Permission granted. I ate like a wolf, hunched over my bowl, scooping the hot, thick stew into my mouth. I didn't care that I was graceless. It was the first real food, the first hot meal I'd had in so long I couldn't remember. When I was done, the bowl scraped clean, I looked up. He was finished too, watching me with that same unnerving stillness. He took our bowls, rinsed them in a bucket of water, and set them aside. Then he went to his bed, pulled off his boots, and lay down on top of the covers, his coat still on. He was asleep, or seemed to be within moments. I remained at the table, the warmth from the fire making me drowsy. The wind howled outside, a lonely, menacing sound, but in here it was warm. It was safe. I looked at the man on the bed. His name, I realized I didn't even know his name. He was my owner, my savior, my captor. He was a complete mystery. After a long while, I rose and went to my cot. I lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. I didn't take off my shift, the only garment I owned. I lay there listening to the fire crackle and the wind scream, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the cold dread of what the night would bring. I just felt quiet. Sometime in the deep dark hours, I woke. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and a chill was creeping back into the room. He was still asleep, a dark shape on the bed. A shudder ran through his body, a reaction to the cold. Without thinking, I got up, took the heavy blanket he had given me from the back of my chair, and walked over to his bed. I stood over him for a moment, my heart pounding. He was vulnerable in sleep, the hard lines of his face softened. I gently draped the blanket over him. He stirred, a low murmur escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. His hand, which had been resting on his chest, twitched, as if some deep sleeping part of him recognized the gesture. I retreated to my cot, my own chill forgotten, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through my chest. The days that followed fell into a silent rhythm dictated by the snow and the cold. We woke before the sun, the air in the cabin frigid. He would rebuild the fire while I melted snow for coffee. We drank it black and strong, sitting at the table in the pre-dawn gloom, the silence between us as thick and heavy as a blanket. His name, I learned, was Silas. I heard it when a lone trapper passed by on the third day, calling out a greeting. "Silas, good to see you're not buried yet." Silas had merely grunted in response, his hand resting on the axe by the woodpile until the man was gone. He was not a man who welcomed visitors. Our work was the work of survival. We spent hours each day sawing and chopping wood, the sharp ring of the axe the only conversation. My hands, soft from disuse, were soon raw and blistered, but I didn't complain. I welcomed the pain, the burn of my muscles. It was real. It was mine. He showed me how to stack the wood so it would dry properly, his large calloused hands guiding mine for a brief moment. His touch firm and impersonal, yet not unkind. He taught me how to check the trap lines he had set in the woods, how to identify the tracks of rabbits and foxes in the snow. He showed me how to reset the traps with a quiet, grim efficiency. The first time we found a rabbit, its body still warm, I felt a pang of pity. He saw it in my face. "The snow doesn't care if you're hungry," was all he said. His voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to me. One afternoon, a blizzard descended, a terrifying wall of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked like a banshee and snow piled up against the door and the small window. We were trapped. For 2 days we were confined to the small cabin. The world shrank to the space of that one room, the fire, and the two of us. I thought the silence would become unbearable, suffocating. But it changed. It softened, becoming less an absence of words and more a form of communication in itself. We moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a quiet choreography of shared existence. I would mend his torn coat while he sharpened his knives, the scrape of steel on stone, a counterpoint to the whisper of my needle through wool. On the second night of the blizzard, we sat by the fire, the wind rattling the very logs of the cabin. He had been staring into the flames for a long time, his face a mask of shadow and light. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice so quiet I almost thought the wind had tricked me. I froze, the needle still in my hand. My name, the one I had buried. It felt strange on my tongue, a word from a foreign language. "Ilara," I whispered. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the fire. "Ilara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He didn't say if it was a good name or a bad one. He just said it, and in doing so he gave it back to me. He rose and went to a small locked chest in the corner, a chest I had never seen him open. He unlocked it and took out a small leather-bound book and a pencil. He set them on the table in front of me. "You can read?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. "Right, too." Another nod. He pushed the book closer. "A person should have their name written down somewhere." I opened the book. The pages were yellowed and empty. With a hand that trembled slightly, I took the pencil, and on the first page I wrote my name. Elara. The letters looked strange powerful. It was a reclamation, a stake driven into the frozen ground of my existence. I was not number 17. I was Elara. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of new snow. The silence was profound, the air clean and sharp. Silas went into town for supplies the first time he had left me alone at the cabin. He didn't lock the door. He didn't tell me to stay. He just saddled his horse and rode off, his figure shrinking against the vast white landscape. I spent the day in a state of nervous agitation. I cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the floor with a stiff brush. I organized the shelves. I walked the perimeter of the small clearing, my new sturdy boots, a silent gift from his last trip, crunching in the snow. The freedom was terrifying. There were no walls, no guards. I could have walked away, but where would I go? The cold and the silence were my only companions out there. This cabin with its quiet, enigmatic owner was the only sanctuary I knew. He returned at dusk, his horse laden with sacks of flour beans and a bolt of thick, dark wool cloth. He set it on the table without a word. Another gift. Another statement. I spent the next few evenings by the fire sewing myself a proper dress. A simple, practical garment that would stand up to the cold. The act of creating something for myself, of choosing the cut and style, was another small piece of my stolen self that I was taking back. One afternoon, a visitor came. He was a man I recognized from the auction, the one with the greasy beard who had bid on me. Finch. He rode up to the cabin, his horse struggling in the deep snow, and dismounted with a swagger. "Silas," he called out, his voice oily. "Heard you were holed up here. Got lonely, did you?" Silas appeared in the doorway, blocking it with his body. I shrank back into the shadows of the cabin, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm not looking for company, Finch," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. Finch's eyes slid past Silas and found me in the dim interior. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "I see that. Keeping your purchase warm. I'd have thought she'd have run off by now, or frozen. You get tired of her, you let me know. I'll take her off your hands." I saw Silas's shoulders tense. His hand moved just slightly to rest on the handle of the axe that was always propped by the door. "This is my land, Silas," said his voice, dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You're not welcome on it. Get on your horse and ride out. Now." Finch's smile faltered. He saw the look in Silas's eyes, the absolute, unshakable resolve. He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. All right. No need to get touchy. Just being neighborly." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the clean white snow, a stain on the landscape. He climbed back on his horse and rode away, but I could feel his eyes on the cabin until he disappeared into the trees. That night, Silas was even more silent than usual. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. He didn't look at me, but I felt the anger radiating from him, a cold, controlled fury. It wasn't directed at me. It was for me. He had stood between me and that man. He had called this his land, and by extension he had declared me under his protection. Before I went to my cot, I took the leather book and wrote on the second page, my handwriting clearer now, more confident. "Some men build fences to keep things in. Others build them to keep things out." I left the book open on the table where he would see it. The incident with Finch changed something between us. A line had been crossed. The quiet between us was no longer just comfortable. It was charged with a new awareness. I found myself watching him more, noticing the small things, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, when he looked out at the snow-covered mountains, the gentleness in his large hands, when he tended to a cut on his horse's leg, the deep weariness that sometimes settled on him when he thought I wasn't looking. One evening he came back from checking the trap lines with a small, struggling bundle in his arms. It was a fox cub, its leg caught in one of the cruel iron traps. My heart went out to the terrified creature. I expected him to kill it quickly, to put it out of its misery. Instead, he brought it inside into the warmth of the cabin. "Legs broken, not torn," he said, his voice rough. "Might be able to set it." For the next hour, we worked together. I held the small, trembling body, murmuring soft, soothing words, while he expertly fashioned a tiny splint from twigs and strips of cloth. His hands, which could split a log with a single blow, were incredibly gentle. When he was done, he placed the fox in a wooden box filled with old rags near the hearth. "It's a wild thing, Elara," he warned, looking at me. "Don't expect it to be grateful." But I did. And for the next few weeks, I cared for the small creature, feeding it scraps of meat and changing its water. Silas watched, saying nothing, but he always made sure there were extra scraps for me to give. The fox, which I named Ash, slowly began to heal. It never became tame, but it stopped seeing me as a threat, and would sometimes eat from my hand. The presence of this third small life in the cabin softened the edges of our existence. It gave us something to care for together, a shared project that required no words. One night, after a long day of clearing a path through a new snowfall, we sat at the table exhausted. I had made a stew, and the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting smell of it. "You cook good," he said, startling me. Praise was a currency he never used. "My mother taught me," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. It was the first time I had mentioned my family. He looked at me, his gray eyes searching my face. What happened to them? The question was gentle, not demanding. I found myself wanting to tell him to unburden myself of the story I had carried like a stone for so long. And so, in a low, halting voice, I told him. I told him about our small farm, about the fever that took my parents, about the bank that took the land, and about the long, dark road that had led me to that auction block. He listened without interrupting his gaze, never leaving my face. When I was finished, my voice choked with unshed tears. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply reached across the table and laid his large, warm hand over mine. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of profound, grounding solidarity. He had heard my story. He had seen my pain. And he was still there. That night, something shifted irrevocably. The space between my cot and his bed, which had once seemed as wide as a canyon, now felt like a small, insignificant gap. I lay awake for hours, listening to his steady breathing, my skin still tingling where he had touched it. The fear I had lived with for so long was gone, replaced by a new terrifying and exhilarating emotion. A few days later, he had to ride to the nearest settlement, a 2-day journey, for supplies we couldn't get from the local town. The thought of being alone for that long filled me with a strange emptiness. The morning he left, the air was sharp and cold. He stood by the door, his saddlebags packed. "You'll be all right?" he asked, his eyes holding mine. "I will," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. He nodded, but still hesitated. Then he did something that stunned me into silence. He stepped forward, gently cupped my chin in his hand, and tilted my face up. He leaned down and pressed his lips to my forehead. The kiss was brief, chaste, and it sent a jolt of pure heat through my entire body. It was a promise, a blessing, a farewell. Then he was gone. The 2 days he was away were the longest of my life. The cabin felt vast and empty without his silent, grounding presence. I cared for Ash. I chopped wood, I cooked for one. I even read from a book of poems I found in his chest the words, "a balm to my lonely soul." But every sound of the wind made me jump, thinking it was the sound of his horse returning. When I finally saw him riding through the trees on the evening of the second day, a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy washed over me. I didn't run out to greet him. I just stood in the doorway, my heart pounding, and watched him approach. He dismounted and walked toward me, his face tired from the long ride. He stopped in front of me, his gray eyes searching my face. And in them I saw it. The same longing, the same quiet desperation I felt in my own heart. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering on my cheek. "I missed you," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "I missed you too, Silas," I whispered, and that was all it took. He closed the small distance between us and gathered me in his arms. His kiss was not gentle like the one on my forehead. It was hungry, desperate, the kiss of a man who had been starving for something he didn't know he needed. I responded with equal fervor, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. All the unspoken words, all the shared glances, all the quiet acts of care culminated in that moment. He lifted me into his arms as if I weighed nothing and carried me inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He didn't carry me to my cot. He carried me to his bed. That night we made love. It was a slow, tender exploration, a discovery of bodies and souls. In his arms I felt not like a possession but a cherished partner. He unwrapped the layers of my pain and fear with a patience and reverence that brought tears to my eyes. And for the first time in my life I felt truly, completely safe. I was not just free from my bonds, I was free to love and be loved. I had found my home not in a place but in the arms of a quiet gentleman who had bought me in the snow. The world was reborn in the spring. As the heavy blanket of snow receded, it revealed a land of tender green shoots and rushing, newly freed streams. Life, dormant and hidden, burst forth with a joyful exuberance that mirrored the changes in my own heart. My belly grew with the child we had created during the long, dark winter nights. Silas's joy was as quiet and deep as everything else about him. I would often find him watching me, a soft, wondering look in his gray eyes. His hands, once so careful not to touch me, were now often resting on my swollen stomach, as if he could feel the miracle of the new life within. He built a new room onto the cabin, a nursery with a large window that faced the morning sun. I sewed curtains and a small quilt, my fingers nimble and sure. We were building a life, a future, one log and one stitch at a time. One sunny afternoon, a man on a horse rode up to our cabin. He was a census taker, a cheerful man with a ledger and a pen. "Good day, folks," he called out. "Just taking the county census." "Name for the head of this household?" "Silas Marlowe." Silas said, his arm resting protectively around my shoulders. "And your wife's name?" "Mr. Marlowe," the man asked, his pen poised. Silas looked down at me, a question in his eyes. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my own. "Elara," I said, my voice clear and strong. "Elara Marlowe." The man wrote it down, tipped his hat, and rode away, leaving us in the warm, peaceful silence. That evening, I took out the leather-bound book. I turned to the last empty page. My hand was steady as I wrote. "Freedom is not a place you run to. It is a home you build. It is a hand that holds yours in the dark. It is a name spoken with love that makes you whole. My name is Elara Marlowe, and I am home." I closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside a small carved wooden fox Silas had made for the baby. Outside, he was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. I went out and sat beside him, leaning my head on his strong shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me, his hand resting on our child. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. In the quiet stillness of the evening, in the place we had built between silence and salvation, our life was just beginning. The story of Elara and Silas carries a message that speaks quietly but powerfully to life at any age. Freedom is not always about running away, but about choosing where and with whom you stay. Elara began as nothing more than a number, stripped of her name and dignity, yet through patience, kindness, and the quiet strength of another, she found her way back to herself. Silas, a man hardened by silence and solitude, discovered that opening his life to someone else gave him purpose again. For those in their later years, the lesson is clear. Even when we believe our best chapters are behind us, there is still room for healing, companionship, and renewal. Life does not end when routines feel heavy or when loneliness sets in. It can begin again in the simplest moments, sharing a meal, working side by side, or just sitting together in silence. The story reminds us that dignity and love are built not with grand gestures, but with steady acts of respect and care. And perhaps the deepest truth is this: no matter how much we've lost, we are never too old to reclaim our name, our worth, and a sense of home. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.